Now we move on to our next film, Last Breath, directed by Alex Parkinson, based off of his documentary of the same name. It follows the true story of a saturation diver on an expedition that goes wrong. Surprisingly, this film is also produced by Met Film, which myself and the producer Matthew actually went to Met Film School. So there's a familiar connection there. I sadly was not able to go and see this film, but my esteemed colleague was, and I'd love to hear what he has to say about it. Reuben, so tell me, were you gasping for breath with this film, or were you just left starved of oxygen?
Well, okay, so first things first, let's talk about the real life events that inspired this film, because they are completely fascinating, completely extraordinary. The documentary of the same name that this is based on is a film which my flatmate watched in 2020 as sort of around the beginning of the pandemic, and she was completely obsessed by it. You know, I remember talking to her and she was just like, oh my goodness, saturation diving is terrifying. And the true story is absolutely amazing. So I'm not going to give anything away here, but if you're interested in knowing how things pan out, you know, true life events are well documented on Wikipedia. The story basically is 3 divers, they're working on the gas pipes which are underneath the North Sea. They're based up in Aberdeen, and engineering work needs to be done on these pipes many feet under the water, where, you know, the pressure is extremely high, and in order to survive at that level of pressure, at that level of depth, it becomes necessary to do what they call saturation diving, where through a very clever scientific process that I can't claim to understand, they're able to regulate the amount of oxygen and other gases in your blood so that your internal organs don't explode at 300 feet depth. So the film basically sees Woody Harrelson and Simu Liu as these kind of older and more experienced divers, helping out our sort of central protagonist, who's actually, he's quite young, he's quite new to the job. I think we know he's done 5 of these dives before. And when we first meet him, he is sort of saying goodbye to his fiancée, Morag, who's, you know, incredibly concerned for his safety. She doesn't like him going down on these missions because it is unbelievably dangerous. There's a good line which in many ways I think sums up the film's desire to have you understand the gravity of the situation, which is, he says to her, it's just like I'm going into space, except I'll be at the bottom of the ocean. You know, so that's really what it is. The bottom of the ocean is basically another planet, because it is so dangerous outside the submarine and outside your own suit that you cannot possibly survive. So what then happens is, the boat that carries these submarines goes out into the North Sea, but encounters technical problems, and whilst diving, Simu Liu and Woody Harrelson and our central protagonist, basically what happens is then the ship that is carrying the submarines heads out into the North Sea, where it swiftly encounters technical problems, and it basically starts to drift in the water, which is a problem because the way that these diving missions work is that attached to a kind of a submersible platform, which they call the Bell, are these divers. So our main hero, Chris, and Dave, the character played by Simu Liu, they're underwater, they're attached by an umbilical cord which is supplying all of their oxygen. But as they're carrying out their engineering works, the ship begins to drift above them and therefore starts dragging them along the bottom of the ocean, which is a problem because Chris's umbilical cord gets trapped around a part of the structure and snaps. He is sent flying off into the depths of the ocean where there is no light, while Simu Liu and the rest of the crew get dragged in the opposite direction, out of control and unable to save him. Chris has 10 minutes of oxygen in his auxiliary tank. So the film then becomes a race against time to save him before the time runs out. So it's an extraordinary true story. That's quite the setup. but it's important to establish the real life stakes that we have here. And, it's fair to say that the film does a good job of making you think, oh my goodness, yes, the bottom of the ocean is the most terrifying place on earth. I felt claustrophobic watching this. I felt panicked watching this. I'm not particularly good with confined spaces, certainly not dark confined spaces. And this did get me feeling quite unnerved, I have to say. And it has some good performances. Everyone is playing their part in trying to save this man's life. And it's sort of a good ensemble production, really. I enjoyed particularly Woody Harrelson. I think he does a great job of kind of grounding the thing in emotion. It's really impressively shot as well. So much of it is underwater, and they shot it in real life underwater, and they really did their best to capture the situation in verisimilitudinous a way as possible. So I was impressed by all of that. And as I mentioned when we were talking about Black Bag, this is a short film. This is 90 minutes in and out, and it really packs a punch in that period. The problem for me is I felt at times it was sort of trying a bit hard to tell a conventional story. There's a lot of, oh, remember your fiancée back home, you've got to survive it for her. There's a lot of that sort of slightly schmaltzy, slightly, I think, cheap storytelling, which it didn't really need. The story is extraordinary enough without that kind of, I think, slightly hackneyed embellishment. And it was just little things like that I was bumping up against and thinking, okay, I understand why we're doing that. I understand why we're infusing the story with that extra sense of jeopardy. But it comes off, I think, to me, as slightly manipulative and perhaps also, slightly exploitative of a real life situation, which I won't tell you what happens, but in many ways is a tragedy. So it's an interesting film. I think it's not as great as it could have been. You can almost imagine a slightly more documentarian-esque approach to this, which might have been even more point of view focused, perhaps. Something to really put you in the suit of Chris as he is stuck at the bottom of the ocean with nobody around him, and no chance of survival. I think that maybe you can imagine a sort of Paul Greengrass style approach to it, which is a little bit more rooted in just what is happening here and now, and the reason we care about these characters is because they're in grave danger. So it's not bad by any means, but I think that it truly could have been exceptional, and at the end it sort of settles for, yeah, pretty good. I enjoyed it more than Black Bag. It was tense, the underwater sequences are very well done, but at times it was a little conventional, and it has an ending which I think is a little on the nose.
From the trailers, it looked a little stock in places. Sadly, I wasn't able to get and see it, which I'd love to, because I'd love to support a film from, our alma mater production house. But it looked a little just like Gravity again, and those sort of trapped in a very desperate situation type movies. So it's very interesting to hear you talk about it, that it's trying to push more than what it needs to, because it was a film that is based on a true story, so it could rest on that, but tries to do those filmmaking techniques to sort of squeeze as much emotion out of the viewer as possible.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I think that it does need to trust that the true events are extraordinary enough and gripping enough and dramatic enough for us to invest in the characters and not kind of revert to this slightly schmaltzy, slightly soapy melodrama that at times I felt it tiptoed into. But it's certainly not a bad film. As I say, the performances are very good, and it's very interestingly, realistically shot as well underwater in a way that gives it a real sense of true peril. So it's good. I'd recommend it. I'll be interested to hear what you have to say about it, Jake. But yes, it's decent.
It sounds like it just floats along rather than sinking to the bottom of the ocean.